A man declared dead, then murdered again. How is that possible? Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Valor. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from today? I truly enjoy reading them. Now, let's begin. It was upon a raw November evening, when a yellow fog pressed so heavily against the windows of Baker Street that the lamps beyond appeared like blurred moons, that the singular affair of the murdered man who died twice first intruded upon our rooms. Holmes had been in one of those moods of silent concentration which I had learned not to disturb. He lay stretched upon the settee, his long, nervous fingers together, his eyes half closed, and the blue smoke of his pipe rising in a thin, wavering line above him. Upon the table at his elbow were a chemical retort, a Persian slipper stuffed with tobacco, 3 newspapers folded to their criminal columns, and a violin, whose strings he had touched but once that afternoon. I had been reading a medical monograph, though in truth my attention wandered often toward my companion. There are silences which soothe, and silences which accuse. Holmes' silence that night was of the latter sort. "You have been to Kensington," said he suddenly. I lowered my book. "My dear Holmes, and you found your patient improving, though not without anxiety concerning the lungs." I stared at him. "Really, Holmes, this is too much. I have not mentioned Kensington. You have mentioned it in every particular but speech," he returned languidly. "There is red gravel upon your left boot, found commonly in the walks near Campden Hill. Your gloves smell faintly of carbolic, which you use only after examining an infectious case, and you have placed your stethoscope in the wrong pocket, a habit you reserve for visits where the chest is involved, and your mind afterward preoccupied. Since you returned with a lighter step than when you left, I infer improvement. Since you twice glanced at the weather, I infer anxiety. You make a miracle of common observation. No, Watson, I make common observation a miracle only to those who do not practice it." He had scarcely spoken when Mrs. Hudson's step sounded upon the stair, accompanied by another, heavier, hurried and uneven. A moment later she opened the door and announced Inspector Lestrade. The little detective entered with his hat damp from the fog and his sharp face unusually grave. Behind him stood a tall gentleman in a dark fur-collared coat, his features pale and strained, yet bearing that unmistakable stamp of breeding which belongs to men accustomed to command attention without requesting it.
"Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Lestrade, "I should be obliged if you would hear Sir Edmund Fairclough of Cavendish Square."
Scotland Yard has had strange cases, but I confess this one has set us at odds. Holmes's eyes opened fully. "Indeed? Pray sit down, Sir Edmund. Lestrade, the chair by the fire is yours. Watson, your notes may be of use." Sir Edmund bowed stiffly and took the seat opposite Holmes. For several seconds, he seemed unable to begin. Then, drawing a folded paper from his breast pocket, he placed it upon the table. "My brother," said he, "Mr. Adrian Fairclough, was murdered last night." "I regret to hear it," said Holmes. Sir Edmund's mouth tightened. "That is not the difficulty, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade leaned forward. "The difficulty is that Mr. Adrian Fairclough was also murdered this morning." Holmes did not move, but I saw the faintest spark kindle in his grey eyes. "A man murdered twice," said he softly. "That is a promising beginning." For a few moments no sound disturbed the room save the dull hiss of the coal fire and the faint mutter of wheels passing in the fog below. Sir Edmund Fairclough sat rigid, his gloved hands resting upon his knees, while Lestrade, who had plainly expected some exclamation from my friend, watched Holmes with the irritated admiration which his calmness so often provoked. "A promising beginning?" cried Sir Edmund at last. "Good God, sir, it is a monstrous business." "All monstrous businesses," said Holmes, "become less monstrous when divided into their component facts. Let us have them in order, if you please. Not conclusions, Sir Edmund, facts." Sir Edmund drew a hand across his brow. "My brother Adrian was the younger son of our family. He lived at Fairclough House in Cavendish Square with me, though we were not," he hesitated, "we were not on terms of perfect affection." "A useful admission," murmured Holmes. "He was a man of considerable charm, but careless, extravagant, and given to unfortunate associations. Last night, shortly after 10 o'clock, he was found dead in the small library." "By whom?" "By Marlowe, our butler. Adrian had gone there after dinner. A pistol lay near his right hand, and there was a wound above the heart. The door was locked from within. The window, which looks upon the side garden, was fastened. At first we believed it suicide. At first, Holmes repeated. Lestrade took up the account. The surgeon would not have it. The wound was fired from too great a distance for self-destruction. There were no powder marks. Besides, the pistol had not been discharged. I could not suppress an exclamation. Then the weapon was placed there. So it appears, said Lestrade. A second pistol was later found in the coal scuttle, recently fired. That gave us murder plainly enough. The locked door was no great puzzle, for there is an old serving hatch concealed behind a bookcase. A slim man might pass through it into the pantry passage. Holmes's eyes had narrowed. And this morning, Sir Edmund's voice sank, this morning my brother's body had been removed to the disused billiard room until arrangements could be made. The police had sealed the library. At 7, when Marlowe went with the constable to examine the body again, they found... He stopped, and for the first time his composure truly deserted him. They found another wound. A knife had been driven into his back. After death? I asked. That is the horror of it, said Lestrade. The doctor says the second wound was made hours after the shooting. The dead man, Mr. Holmes, was stabbed while lying under police watch. Holmes rose and began to pace the hearthrug, his dressing gown flowing about his thin figure like a scholar's robe. A corpse shot in a locked room at 10 and stabbed in another room before 7. Who had access to the billiard room? The household, answered Lestrade. Sir Edmund, his ward Miss Clara Henshaw, Mr. Adrian's secretary Victor Pike, Lady Beatrice Vane, who was dining there, the servants, and my own constable, placed outside the corridor. Outside the corridor is not inside the room. No, Lestrade admitted, but the door was locked and the key remained with the constable. Holmes stopped. Ah, another locked room, precisely. I confess that the repetition chilled me more than the crime itself. There was something obscene in the persistence of violence against a man already beyond harm, as though the murderer had feared not life, but the testimony of death. Holmes turned to Sir Edmund. What was taken? Taken? Nothing that I know. Then what was altered? Sir Edmund looked blank. Lestrade frowned. We have not yet determined that anything was altered, except the body. My dear Lestrade, when a murderer risks returning to a corpse watched by the police, he does not do so for artistic completeness. He wants something, hides something, or changes the meaning of something. Now, Sir Edmund, who benefits by your brother's death? The baronet stiffened. I do, materially. Adrian's allowance reverted to the estate. And emotionally, Sir Edmund flushed. We quarrelled. I will not deny it. He had threatened to expose certain family matters. What matters? That I cannot say. Holmes' glance became hard. Cannot? Will not, unless necessity compels me. Holmes gave a dry smile. Necessity is a hound, Sir Edmund. It usually arrives before the gentleman expects it. Lestrade cleared his throat. There is also Victor Pike. He had been dismissed by Mr. Adrian yesterday afternoon, after a violent disagreement. Miss Henshaw heard Adrian accuse him of stealing letters. Letters again, said Holmes. And Lady Beatrice Vane. Sir Edmund seemed still more uncomfortable. Lady Beatrice was once engaged to my brother. The match was broken off. By whom? By her family publicly. By Adrian privately, I believe. And Miss Clara Henshaw? My ward. She has lived with us since her father died in India. Adrian wished to marry her. I opposed it. For financial reasons? For every reason, said Sir Edmund sharply. Holmes resumed his seat and took the folded paper from the table. And this? Sir Edmund leaned forward. It was found this morning pinned to the cloth covering my brother's body. Holmes unfolded it delicately. Upon the page, in large uneven characters, were written the words, He lied once. He shall not lie twice. Holmes studied the message for a long interval. Then he held it toward the lamp, smelled it, and passed it to me. What do you observe, Watson? The hand is disguised, said I, wishing not to disappoint him. The paper is ordinary, the ink somewhat pale. Excellent as far as it goes, which is not far. Lestrade? The message proves revenge, said the inspector. Someone believed Mr. Adrian had lied. My dear fellow, most men have lied. That narrows our field insufficiently. Holmes folded the sheet again. The interest lies in the pinholes. Pinholes? There are 2 sets. One where it was pinned to the corpse, and another older set near the fold. This message, or at least this paper, has been displayed before. Sir Edmund stared. Displayed? Where? That, said Holmes, is what we shall discover at Cavendish Square. Within 20 minutes we had exchanged the warmth of Baker Street for the damp obscurity of the London streets. The fog lay thick along Oxford Street, muffling hoofbeats and turning the gas lamps into faint yellow wounds in the murk. Sir Edmund's carriage carried us westward, Lestrade opposite me, and Holmes silent beside the window, his face so still that one might have thought him asleep had not his fingers moved ceaselessly upon his knee. At Cavendish Square, Fairclough House rose out of the fog with a grim dignity, a broad-fronted mansion of dark brick, its windows shuttered, its steps guarded by a constable whose cape shone wet in the lamplight. The door was opened by Marlowe, a gaunt, elderly butler whose expression had the polished emptiness of long service, though I detected a tremor in the hand that held the candle. Holmes paused upon the threshold and looked down. "You have had many visitors since the rain began," said he. Marlowe blinked. "The police, sir, the doctor, Sir Edmund's solicitor, and a woman in narrow boots who hesitated before entering." The butler's face changed by the smallest degree. "Lady Beatrice returned for her cloak, sir." "After the murder?" "This afternoon, sir." Holmes said nothing, but passed into the hall. It was a sombre place, panelled in oak, with portraits of stern Fairclough ancestors watching from the walls, as if resentful that scandal had entered their house. Somewhere above, a woman was sobbing softly, and then abruptly ceased. "The library first," said Holmes. Lestrade led the way down a passage to a small room at the rear. The seal had been broken for our entry. Inside, the air still held the faint acrid odour of discharged powder, though the windows were shut and the fire was out. Books lined 3 walls. A heavy desk stood near the hearth. On the carpet, marked in chalk, was the place where Adrian Fairclough had fallen. Holmes became at once transformed. The languid gentleman of Baker Street vanished. In his place appeared the keen hound of inquiry, silent, swift, and tireless. He dropped to his knees by the chalk mark, examined the carpet with his lens, measured the distance to the hearth, peered behind the bookcase where the concealed hatch stood ajar, and finally turned his attention to the desk. I watched Lestrade grow impatient. "Well," said the inspector, "you see the hatch. That is how the murderer left." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "perhaps. The obvious exit is often prepared for the obvious mind." He lifted from the desk a small bronze paperweight in the form of a crouching lion. Beneath it lay a faint ring of dust, except at one edge where the surface was clean. "This object has been moved," said he. "By the murderer, by someone with fingers slightly stained with silver nitrate." I glanced at him in astonishment. "How can you know that?" "Because there is a blackened crescent upon the bronze, where a damp chemical finger touched it. A photographer, Watson, or one who handles photographic plates." "Victor Pike practiced photography," said Sir Edmund from the doorway. "He made studies of old manuscripts." Lestrade gave a satisfied grunt. "There now." Holmes did not smile. He crossed to the hearth and picked something minute from the rug with his forceps. It was a shred of pale blue wax. "Sealing wax?" I asked. "Not sealing wax. Dental wax, unless I am much mistaken." He placed it carefully in an envelope. "Now, gentlemen, let us see the room in which the dead man received his second visitor." The billiard room lay across the rear corridor, a large, cold chamber smelling of dust, leather, and stale cigar smoke. In the centre stood the long table, covered. Against the far wall, upon 2 trestles, rested the covered form of Adrian Fairclough. Even Holmes, accustomed as he was to every variety of human tragedy, approached it with grave restraint. He drew back the sheet. Adrian Fairclough had been a handsome man of perhaps 35, with fair hair brushed carefully back, a narrow moustache, and features marked less by vice than weakness. The wound in the breast was hidden by his linen. The later wound, we were told, lay beneath him. Holmes bent over the face. Suddenly he reached toward the dead man's mouth. Lestrade started. "What is it?" Holmes withdrew his hand. Between his fingers gleamed a tiny fragment of dark thread caught upon a tooth. "Curious," said he. Sir Edmund shuddered. "Does it matter?" Holmes looked up, and his expression was unreadable. "My dear Sir Edmund, in this house it may prove that nothing else matters at all." Holmes slipped the tiny fragment of black thread into a small envelope, with the same meticulous care he had shown toward the blue wax recovered from the library carpet. He neither explained his interest nor encouraged speculation. Experience had taught me that when my friend adopted such silence, his thoughts were already weaving together facts which to others appeared hopelessly disconnected. Lestrade, however, was not a man fashioned for prolonged uncertainty. "A thread," said he, folding his arms. "If every tailor in London is to become a suspect, we shall require another police force." Holmes smiled faintly, without raising his eyes from the dead man's face. "It is never the size of the clue, Lestrade, but the circumstances in which it appears. A pebble upon a beach tells us nothing. A pebble upon a drawing-room carpet deserves inquiry." He continued his examination with extraordinary patience. Adrian Fairclough's cuffs were spotless. His boots retained a fine dusting of pale gravel, though they had not left the library after death. His left sleeve showed the slightest crease near the elbow, as though someone had lifted the arm carefully rather than dragged the body. Holmes examined each finger individually before turning to me. "Watson, would you be so good as to observe the fingernails?" I complied. "They are remarkably clean." "Precisely." Sir Edmund looked puzzled. "My brother was always particular, so I perceive. Yet the gardener informs us it rained heavily before dinner, and Mr. Fairclough walked in the garden shortly before 7. A gentleman who strolls through wet flower beds generally acquires a trace of earth beneath his nails, however carefully dressed he may be." "You have spoken to the gardener already?" asked Lestrade in surprise. Holmes glanced toward the open window. "No. His wheelbarrow stands beneath the yew hedge. The soil upon it is fresh, and there are footprints leading from the kitchen entrance to the greenhouse." It seemed the simplest explanation. Lestrade gave one of his familiar sighs. "There are moments, Mr. Holmes, when I suspect you gather evidence while the rest of us are still climbing out of the carriage. My dear fellow, evidence is always waiting. It merely dislikes introducing itself." He rose and carefully replaced the sheet over the body. "I should like to inspect the wound made this morning." The police surgeon, who had remained discreetly outside the room, was summoned. With professional delicacy, he assisted Holmes in turning the body just enough to reveal the knife injury. It had entered between the shoulder blades with remarkable precision. Only that single sound escaped Holmes. The surgeon cleared his throat. The blade penetrated after death. There was practically no bleeding. "The angle?" Holmes asked. "Downward by perhaps 15 degrees. Holmes nodded. "A tall man, or a shorter man, standing upon a slight elevation?" Holmes looked slowly around the billiard room. His gaze rested for a second upon a low leather footstool near the wall, before moving on without comment. Instead, he walked to each door and window, testing locks and hinges. The constable remained outside. "He never left his post," replied Lestrade. "No sound?" "None." "No visitors?" "Only myself, the surgeon, and Sir Edmund, shortly after midnight." Sir Edmund looked uncomfortable. "I merely wished to assure myself," he faltered, "that your brother was truly dead." "No, that everything was secure." Holmes inclined his head courteously, neither accepting nor rejecting the explanation. We proceeded into the principal drawing-room, where tea had been laid with touching adherence to routine despite the tragedy hanging over the household. There we were introduced to the remaining occupants of Fairclough House. Miss Clara Henshaw rose first. She was perhaps 26 years of age, graceful without affectation, with intelligent grey eyes whose quiet composure seemed born not of indifference but of disciplined self-command. Mourning had deepened the natural pallor of her features, yet there remained an unmistakable strength beneath her gentleness. "My uncle has spoken of your abilities, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "I hope sincerely that they are deserved." Holmes bowed. "I hope so too, Miss Henshaw. My reputation suffers greatly whenever I disappoint deserving clients." A faint smile crossed her lips despite herself. Lady Beatrice Vane proved an altogether different personality. Tall, fashionable, and strikingly beautiful, she possessed the confident bearing of one long accustomed to society's admiration, yet her dark eyes betrayed recent exhaustion. "I have already answered Inspector Lestrade's questions," she observed coolly. "I have no doubt you answered them admirably," Holmes replied. "My own questions are seldom identical." Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The final member of the party entered only after several minutes. Victor Pike was younger than I had anticipated, perhaps 30, with carefully trimmed dark hair and spectacles that magnified thoughtful blue eyes. His clothes were neat though plainly worn, and there clung to his cuffs a faint chemical odor which immediately reminded me of Holmes's earlier observation regarding photographic solutions. "So," Pike said with restrained bitterness, "Sir Edmund has engaged London's celebrated consulting detective. I understand you were Mr. Fairclough's secretary. I was dismissed yesterday. For stealing letters." Pike's jaw tightened. "I stole nothing, but the accusation was made. Repeatedly. Why? Because Mr. Fairclough had misplaced certain correspondence and preferred blaming others to admitting carelessness." Holmes watched him steadily. "You are interested in photography." "I am. Particularly early photographic processes involving silver nitrate." Pike blinked. "Yes, I thought as much." Nothing more was said upon the subject, yet I noticed Holmes quietly comparing Pike's hands with the chemical stain left upon the bronze paperweight. Whatever conclusion he reached remained locked behind his impassive expression. The interviews commenced one after another. Miss Henshaw admitted hearing Adrian quarrel violently with Pike before dinner. "They were shouting in the study," she said. "Mr. Fairclough demanded the return of certain family letters." "Did Mr. Pike deny possessing them?" "He scarcely had the opportunity. Mr. Fairclough dismissed him immediately. And later, I saw Adrian alive only once more, when, shortly before 10, he crossed the hall carrying a candle toward the library. Alone." "I believed so." "You believed?" She frowned thoughtfully. "There was someone outside." "Outside the house?" "Yes. I glanced through the front window and thought I saw a gentleman standing across the square." "You thought?" "The fog was thick." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Lady Beatrice's account proved equally intriguing. She admitted having once been engaged to Adrian Fairclough, but insisted the attachment had ended years before. "He possessed charm," she said evenly, "but very little honor. You remained his friend." "I remained acquainted. That is not always the same thing." "No. You returned today for your cloak." "I had forgotten it." "You entered the library." "No." "The billiard room." "Certainly not." Holmes studied her for several moments. "Forgive me, Lady Beatrice, but your gloves appear unusually new." She looked down. "I purchased them yesterday." "A practical decision." "So it seemed." Again Holmes let the matter drop. Finally came Marlowe, the butler. The old servant answered every question with measured precision. He had discovered the body. He had summoned Sir Edmund. He had admitted the police. Nothing in his account varied from that already supplied. Only once did Holmes interrupt. "You have served the Fairclough family many years." 38, sir." "You were fond of Mr. Adrian?" The butler hesitated almost imperceptibly. "I was loyal to the family." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "Loyalty and affection are admirable companions, Mr. Marlowe, though they are not identical." The butler lowered his eyes. "No, sir." As the interviews concluded, Holmes wandered alone into the entrance hall, while the rest of us remained occupied. Curious, I followed. He stood before an enormous grandfather clock, whose polished case reached nearly to the ceiling. "What interests you?" I asked. Without replying, he opened the narrow door of the clock. Inside, upon the wooden floor beneath the pendulum, lay a minute sprinkling of pale blue wax, identical in color to that recovered from the library. Holmes closed the case immediately. "Watson," he said softly, "our murderer is either remarkably ingenious or remarkably frightened." "Frightened of what?" He looked toward the staircase where the portraits of long-dead Fairclough ancestors seemed to watch us from the shadows. "Of something," he answered quietly, "that the dead man carried with him long after his life had ended." Before I could frame another question, the front bell rang sharply through the silent house. Marlowe admitted a breathless young messenger carrying a sealed envelope. "It was handed to me in Portland Place, sir," the boy explained. "The gentleman who gave it said it must reach Mr. Sherlock Holmes without delay." Holmes broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet bearing only one sentence, written in the same uneven disguised hand as the message pinned to Adrian Fairclough's body. "You are looking at the second murder. Find the first." For the first time since the case had begun, I saw Holmes's eyes brighten with unmistakable excitement. "My dear Watson," he said, folding the note into his pocketbook, "our anonymous correspondent has just performed us an unexpected kindness." "A kindness?" "Indeed. He has confirmed that everyone in this house, including ourselves, has been asking the wrong question from the very beginning." Lestrade looked from Holmes to the anonymous note and back again with unconcealed irritation. "I cannot congratulate the fellow upon his manners," said the inspector. "If he possesses information, why not come directly to the yard instead of indulging in melodrama?" Holmes folded the paper with deliberate care before placing it inside his notebook. "Because, my dear Lestrade, he fears someone more than he trusts the police. You believe the message. I believe nothing. I merely observe that whoever wrote it possesses knowledge unavailable to the public. That alone renders it valuable." Sir Edmund had risen from his chair. "What does it mean that you are looking at the second murder?" Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "It means precisely what it says, though not necessarily what it appears to say. But Adrian was murdered only last night. Physically, yes." The room fell silent. Holmes turned toward the fire, clasping his hands behind his back. "Tell me, Sir Edmund, when did your brother cease to be the man everyone believed him to be?" The question seemed so unexpected that the baronet blinked. "I do not understand." "I think you do." Sir Edmund hesitated before replying. "About 6 months ago." "What occurred then?" "He became different." "In what respect?" "He dismissed old acquaintances. He abandoned certain habits almost overnight. He was unusually secretive. He received letters which he burned immediately after reading. More than once I found him searching through the family archives late into the night." "Did he explain this change?" "No." Holmes nodded slowly. "A man may die before he is murdered, Watson." I knew better than to interrupt. "The anonymous writer suggests," Holmes continued, "that Mr. Adrian Fairclough's true destruction occurred earlier than the bullet which ended his life." Lestrade frowned. "You are speaking in riddles again." "I am speaking of identity." The inspector remained unconvinced, but before he could protest further, Holmes addressed Miss Henshaw. "You mentioned that Mr. Fairclough searched the archives." "Yes." "Where are these archives kept?" "In the old morning room. Would you be kind enough to show me?" She led us to a chamber overlooking the rear gardens, seldom used except for storing generations of family records. Dust lay thick upon the shelves, and the odor of old leather and yellowing paper hung heavily in the air. Cabinets lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Holmes removed his gloves before examining them. "This room has been disturbed recently," he observed. Lestrade looked around. "I see nothing." "Exactly." "What? There is no dust." The inspector stared. Holmes pointed toward the lower drawers. "Observe the handles. Every cabinet bears years of accumulated dust except these 3. They have been cleaned repeatedly by recent use." Miss Henshaw nodded. "Those contain correspondence." "Family correspondence?" "Yes." Holmes knelt before the first drawer. It contained neatly bundled letters, spanning nearly a century. The second drawer held legal documents, wills, and estate records. The third, however, had clearly been disturbed. Several bundles had been untied and carelessly replaced. Holmes examined each ribbon without immediately opening the papers. "Interesting. What is it?" I asked. 3 ribbons. I looked more closely. 2 were faded crimson. The third was new, deep blue. Holmes lifted the blue ribbon carefully. "It has recently replaced an older one." "How can you tell?" "The knot has not settled. Furthermore, the silk is modern, while the others are nearly 20 years old." He untied the bundle. Inside were letters exchanged between successive members of the Fairclough family. Holmes read only the dates. Then he suddenly stopped. "Ah." He withdrew one folded sheet. "It has been removed and replaced several times." Lestrade sighed. "Because it is old?" "No, because the fold marks differ." He handed it to me. Sure enough, faint creases crossed the paper at angles inconsistent with its present folding. Someone had repeatedly hidden or unfolded it. Before Holmes could examine its contents, Sir Edmund spoke sharply. "That letter concerns private family matters." Holmes looked up calmly. "Then they have become public matters through murder." The baronet coloured. After a brief struggle with himself, he nodded reluctantly. "Very well." Holmes unfolded the document. It proved to be a letter written 25 years earlier by Sir Edmund's late father. Its contents dealt chiefly with financial arrangements following the death of a distant cousin. Nothing appeared remarkable until Holmes reached the final paragraph. His eyes lingered there considerably longer. Without comment, he folded the letter again and returned it to its place. "You have found something," I whispered. "I have found omission." "Omission?" "The final page refers to an enclosed document. There is none." "Precisely." Miss Henshaw looked surprised. "I never noticed that." "Few people notice what is absent." Holmes closed the drawer. The enclosure disappeared recently. You think Adrian took it? Asked Lestrade. I think someone did. And that document was worth killing for. Holmes neither confirmed nor denied the suggestion. Instead, he walked toward the windows overlooking the gardens. Rain had ceased. The evening fog drifted low among the shrubs like pale smoke. Holmes suddenly opened the French doors and stepped outside. The remainder of us followed. The narrow gravel path curved toward a stone sundial before dividing around an ancient yew hedge. Holmes examined the ground with his lens. There are many footprints, observed Lestrade. Yes. Impossible to distinguish. On the contrary, he pointed toward the damp gravel. Observe these impressions. I saw at once they were unusually narrow. A woman's boots? I suggested. Perhaps. He measured the distance between each print. No. They're too long. They're too regular. Lestrade looked puzzled. What does that signify? Someone accustomed to walking carefully. He followed the impressions until they disappeared beside the greenhouse. There, Holmes halted. The glass door stood slightly ajar. Inside, rows of orchids, ferns, and exotic plants filled the humid interior. Condensation covered every pane. Holmes breathed deeply. Photographic chemicals. Victor Pike, who had accompanied us at a respectful distance, stepped forward. I sometimes used one corner as a darkroom. The lighting suited the work. You developed plates here? Frequently. Holmes inspected a workbench. Several bottles remained. Silver nitrate, developer, fixing solution. Exactly as Pike had described. Yet Holmes seemed interested not in the chemicals but in the rubbish basket beneath the table. He emptied it carefully. Broken glass, discarded paper, twine, and finally a small piece of black cloth with its edge freshly torn. Holmes compared it silently with the black thread recovered from Adrian Fairclough's teeth. The fibers matched perfectly. Pike frowned. I have never seen that. No? No. Holmes slipped the cloth into another evidence envelope. You wear spectacles, Mr. Pike. Yes. You are nearsighted. I am. Without them, I should scarcely recognize a face across this greenhouse. Holmes nodded almost imperceptibly. I see. When we returned toward the house, Marlowe hurried across the lawn. Mr. Holmes, what is it? The constable at the front gate has detained someone. We found the officer waiting beside a shabbily dressed man of about 50, whose weather-beaten face suggested years spent outdoors. The fellow twisted his cap nervously. I've done nothing wrong. Your name? Holmes asked. Thomas Bell. What brings you here? I came to see Mr. Adrian. You were unaware of his death. The man stared. Dead. Holmes watched him with close attention. The astonishment appeared entirely genuine. I had a message for him. From whom? Bell hesitated. I promised not to say. Holmes removed a sovereign from his pocket. Promises often weaken before gold. The messenger glanced around uneasily. It came from a gentleman I met every month near Paddington Station. What gentleman? I never knew his name. What did he look like? Tall, grey beard, walked with a stick. When did you last see him? This morning. Every eye turned toward him. This morning. Yes, sir. What instructions did he give? Bell reached into his worn coat and produced a sealed envelope. He said if anything happened to Mr. Adrian Fairclough before Thursday, I was to deliver this only into his own hands. Holmes accepted the envelope but did not immediately open it. Instead, he examined the seal. Blue wax. The identical shade we had already encountered in the library and inside the grandfather clock. Without a word, he broke it. Inside lay a single folded sheet and an old cabinet photograph. The photograph showed two young men standing beside one another before a country house. One was unmistakably Adrian Fairclough in his youth. The other had been carefully scratched away with a sharp blade until the features were almost entirely destroyed. Only one detail remained untouched. Upon the stranger's waistcoat hung a distinctive watch chain ending in a small silver lion. Holmes became perfectly still. Very slowly he looked from the photograph to Sir Edmund Fairclough, then to the bronze lion paperweight we had earlier observed upon the library desk, now visible through the open window. Finally he folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. My dear Watson, he said quietly, though his eyes never left the house before us, we have just crossed the threshold from mystery into conspiracy. A chill, deeper than the damp evening air, settled upon me. For I knew from Holmes's voice that the case had taken its decisive turn, and that somewhere within Fairclough House There remained a person desperate enough to kill, not merely a man, but every fragment of the truth he had left behind. The following morning found Holmes in an unusually reflective mood. He had scarcely spoken during our return to Baker Street, and even at breakfast he occupied himself more with arranging the photograph, the anonymous notes, the fragment of blue wax, the strip of black cloth, and the tiny thread upon the table, than with his meal. At last he rose, selected his violin, and drew from it a single sustained note, before laying the instrument aside once more. "It is complete, Watson. You have reached the truth. I have reached the only explanation which accommodates every fact. What remains is not deduction, but demonstration." Before noon we returned to Fairclough House at Holmes' request. Lestrade had assembled the entire household in the library, where Adrian Fairclough had met his death. Sir Edmund stood rigid beside the fireplace. Miss Clara Henshaw retained her quiet composure, though anxiety shadowed her face. Lady Beatrice Vane watched with folded arms, while Victor Pike appeared pale from another sleepless night. Marlowe stood discreetly behind them, his expression as unreadable as ever. Holmes remained standing near Adrian's desk, resting one hand upon the bronze paperweight, shaped like a crouching lion. "Ladies and gentlemen," said he, "you have all been asking who murdered Adrian Fairclough. The anonymous correspondent who wrote to me was correct. That is the wrong question." A murmur passed through the room. "The proper question is this: what truth survived Adrian Fairclough, and who feared it so greatly that they attacked his body after death?" Lestrade folded his arms. "You believe the stabbing was intended to hide something?" "I do." Holmes lifted the photograph recovered from the sealed envelope. "The answer begins years before the crime. This damaged photograph once showed two young men. One was Adrian Fairclough. The other has been deliberately destroyed, save for one object, the silver lion upon his watch chain." He placed the photograph beside the bronze lion paperweight. "The same lion appears here." Sir Edmund frowned. "It was merely a family ornament." "No," replied Holmes. "It was a family emblem, reproduced in only a handful of pieces by a London silversmith nearly 30 years ago. One remained upon this desk. Another adorned the watch chain in this photograph." He turned toward the assembled company. "Adrian Fairclough had discovered the identity of the second man." Silence followed. "The missing enclosure from your family correspondence," Holmes continued, looking at Sir Edmund, "was not money, nor a will. It was a declaration acknowledging the existence of another heir to the Fairclough estate. The child had been born outside marriage, and quietly hidden from society." Sir Edmund's face lost its colour. You found that?" "I found the evidence that it had existed. Adrian found the document itself." Holmes paused. "He spent the last 6 months attempting to identify that forgotten heir." Miss Henshaw looked astonished. "Then the letters were not evidence of blackmail," said Holmes. "They were evidence of investigation." Victor Pike suddenly spoke. "I knew he was searching for someone." Every eye turned toward him. "You never told the police," Lestrade exclaimed. "Because I had promised Adrian I would not. He feared the wrong person would learn the truth before he had proof." Holmes inclined his head, and he was correct. He crossed slowly toward Marlowe. "You served the Fairclough family faithfully for 38 years. "Yes, sir." "You knew every secret preserved within these walls." "I knew only my duty." Holmes regarded him steadily. "No, Mr. Marlowe, you knew something else." The old butler did not reply. "You knew the identity of the forgotten heir." For the first time, Marlowe's composure faltered. "It was you who guided Adrian toward the archives. It was you who remembered the missing enclosure. It was you who arranged for the messenger to deliver the photograph should Adrian die." Sir Edmund stared. "Marlowe?" The butler lowered his head. "I could not allow the truth to perish." Holmes nodded gently. "You were never the murderer." Lestrade looked bewildered. "Then why conceal all this?" "Because he had given his word to the late master." Holmes turned away. "The murderer is not the man who preserved the secret." His gaze settled quietly upon Sir Edmund Fairclough. "It is the man who spent 25 years ensuring that it never emerged." The room seemed to freeze. Sir Edmund laughed once, harshly. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Holmes spoke with perfect calm. "You quarreled with Adrian because he confronted you with the missing declaration. He had discovered that the forgotten heir died years ago without descendants, meaning no fortune was actually at stake. What remained at risk was your reputation." Sir Edmund's lips tightened. You forged correspondence to suggest Victor Pike had stolen letters. You encouraged suspicion toward Lady Beatrice through your brother's broken engagement. Every false lead pointed conveniently away from yourself. Lestrade stepped forward. The locked library, the concealed serving hatch provided entry and escape. Sir Edmund alone possessed unrestricted access without attracting notice. And the second attack? Holmes answered before Sir Edmund could speak. Adrian had concealed the missing declaration inside the lining of his coat before his death. Sir Edmund believed it remained upon the body. During the night he entered the billiard room with the duplicate key entrusted to him, under the pretext of checking the house. Sir Edmund's eyes widened involuntarily. The knife was never intended as murder, Holmes continued. It was used to rip open the lining quickly, while disguising the search as another act of violence. Holmes reached for Adrian's coat, preserved among the evidence. The lining has indeed been cut. Lestrade examined it. Good heavens! The document was no longer there, Holmes said. Adrian had already hidden it elsewhere. The grandfather clock, I exclaimed. Holmes smiled. The blue wax found inside the clock case marked the hiding place. Adrian sealed the folded declaration within the hollow base behind the pendulum. Sir Edmund searched the body, while the true document remained safely hidden only a few yards away. Lestrade hurried to the hall. Within moments he returned carrying a yellowed envelope recovered exactly where Holmes had described. The inspector broke the ancient seal. Inside lay the missing declaration. Every detail Holmes had inferred stood confirmed. Sir Edmund sank slowly into a chair. For several moments no one spoke. Then, in a voice suddenly stripped of all pride, he said quietly, "I never intended to kill him." Holmes answered without triumph. No murderer ever plans to become one. They merely plan one dishonest act too many. Sir Edmund buried his face in his hands. He said he would publish everything. "And so you shot him." "I only wished to frighten him." "We struggled." His voice failed. Lestrade stepped forward. "Sir Edmund Fairclough, I arrest you for the murder of Adrian Fairclough." The baronet offered no resistance. As the officers led him away, Marlowe closed his eyes with an expression of profound weariness, while Miss Henshaw silently took Lady Beatrice's trembling hand. Victor Pike remained motionless before the fire, staring not at the departing prisoner, but at the recovered declaration, as though years of suspicion had at last been lifted from his shoulders. When we had left the house, and were once more walking through the misty streets, I turned to Holmes. The anonymous notes, Marlowe, the messenger, also Marlowe. He dared not accuse his master openly, yet he could leave me a trail. And the words, "He was murdered twice." Holmes drew his coat closer against the chill. Entirely accurate. Adrian Fairclough suffered one death from his brother's bullet. The second was an attempt to destroy the truth he had uncovered. Had that succeeded, history would have remembered him as a liar, a blackmailer, perhaps even a suicide. Reputation, Watson, sometimes survives longer than flesh. To murder a man's good name is often the cruelest crime. For a little while we walked in silence through the London fog. At length I remarked, "It is a melancholy conclusion." "My dear Watson," said Holmes with a faint smile, "most mysteries end not by revealing human wickedness, but human weakness. The former is common enough. It is the latter which proves fatal." With that he glanced toward the waiting hansom cab. "I think," said he, "that Mrs. Hudson may still have preserved a respectable luncheon from the depredations of my chemical experiments. After so much death, one should not neglect the comforts of the living." I could only laugh, for the familiar practicality of the remark restored at once the balance of his remarkable mind. As our cab disappeared into the swirling London fog, I reflected once again that while many men possessed intelligence, only Sherlock Holmes united reason with such relentless fidelity to the truth. It was a lesson I never ceased to admire, and one which, after many years in his company, continued to astonish me.